Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of the GoMobi.work coaching series. Each week, we pick a topic in coaching and performance management, something that you can use to take back to your team to help you work better together. And we talk about it. So each week is a different theme. This week, we're going to be talking about something that we feel very strongly is effective, and that is continuous performance management. So what does it mean to buck the norms of what performance management looks like in the typical business environment today, and the advantages that that can have for our team? So we're going to be sharing with you some of our ideas today. Once again, my name is Wade Bruffy. I'm the co-founder and CEO of GoMobi.work, and I am joined, as always, by my co-founder, Zoltan Sarda.
Hi, everyone. Glad to have you all here. I hope this session is helpful. Again, as Wade said, this is a constant topic between the two of us talking about this work, both the opportunities of it and some of the complications from it. And so we're going to share some of our thoughts on this with you today.
Yeah, beautiful. All right. Well, we will jump right in and get our screen set up so that you can see the presentation that we've prepared for you today. And make sure that it looks, there we go. Perfect.
There we go. Okay.
Okay. So the first thing that we wanted to set the stage with really is why we give feedback in the first place. And I feel like anybody who's a leader knows that the reason that we give feedback and we try to make that feedback as effective as possible is because great feedback inspires change. And when we can inspire people to become different, we can have an incredible impact. So that's the idea when it's done well. Now, that doesn't always happen. And so we have to be aware that ineffective feedback is disempowering and it's not helpful. And in the worst of instances, hopefully this doesn't happen, but sometimes feedback can even feel like an attack, something that somebody has to defend from. So we really feel strongly that this is one of the hardest things to get right. And it's something that even the most well-intentioned leaders, by following traditional wisdom, traditional practices, can get wrong no matter how badly they or how much they want to do it better. So it's not always somebody's fault. It's a structural thing, but we're going to talk about that today.
Okay. So this idea and going to this piece, I think this is one of the really interesting pieces of performance improvement for anybody is, and it really ties into what Wade was talking about that balance of feeling attacked versus the balance of feeling supported and open. But really, if you're anything you're wanting to do to get better at, it's really this exercise in maintaining your openness and vulnerability. You have to be open about what the things are that you need to work on, and vulnerable about really being able to say, okay, I can hear that information and sort of think about what it means to me, and still maintain my ability to move forward in my work. So that idea with a manager, like when you're thinking about effective managers, what they are doing is they are supporting their employees in staying in that vulnerable state, but also helping to manage it and making it a safe space. That's the key here. So some of part of our talk today is really focused on a couple of ways to think about how do you maintain that managed aspect of vulnerability and the safety of it. And so part of it is this balance. It's like this equation of what do we need. So in order to improve, we need vulnerability, but we also need this sense of agency and control and the sense of confidence, like I can do this, that kind of thing, or I'm in charge of this, or I actually know what my abilities are and where I can have some say in what I'm doing and be able to say, yeah, I've got that managed. And what that leads to is this sense of confidence. So really, it's not just about vulnerability; it's about the balance between vulnerability and the sense of confidence. Too much confidence, we don't learn too much. Too much vulnerability, we shut down. So the ideal balance is where we have both of those things working. And it's really effective managers are really good at helping maintain that balance with the people that they're coaching. So it's the idea of managing vulnerability. We talked in an earlier conversation about attributional bias. And this is, again, just to briefly explain, it's this idea of how do we explain our abilities, how do we explain our who we are, what happens to us, other people's relations to us. And if you go back and look at that talk on attributional bias, it's really around this idea of when we explain our experience, when we explain like what we're good at, when we're talking about what happens to us, what the outcomes of our work or anything, do we explain it from a contextual position? Do we say, so this is the situation that I was in, and I can actually have some control over that situation, and I know it's something outside of me? Or is it that I'm explaining it as something that's inside me? And part of the problem is here, if we think about if it's inside, if it's part of us, it's harder to manage and control than if it's the outside of the situation. So this idea, one of the examples that we gave earlier in that earlier talk was, if you fail a math test, how do you explain it? You could either explain it saying, I'm terrible at math, which is a dispositional aspect, which really leaves you kind of no hope. There's not much way to just suddenly be better at math if you're terrible at it. Or rather, is it the context? So could I have studied more? Could I have gone and talked to my teacher more? Could I have done any of those things? And I think that that's the balance that we want, is how do we help the people we're working with stay on that contextual side in their explanations of what they're doing. So part of this, and part of the attributional bias, we didn't really talk about it in that last talk, but a big part of it has to do with what researchers call the locus of control. So where is the center of control? Where is it? And does it lay inside the employee? Does the employee see that I've got the ability to control this situation? Or is it something outside of me? I really don't have any control, and this is just stuff that happens to me. And so effective people, in thinking about like really effective people in all fields, they go with that contextual bias. They say, this is the situation. And then they also say, so here is what's under my control. And they don't focus on things that are out of their control. They focus only on things that are in their control. So this is a situation we want as a coach to bring that into our conversations, where we're getting our employees to say, yeah, here's something that I can manage. Here's something that I can take on because I can have control over that. These other things I don't have any control over. And so, and that idea of, part of this idea of in coaching, particularly in the business area, is what is that context? And most of the time, I would say that the context is that I need to work on my skills more, and I need to work on my knowledge more. So how do I focus on having both of those pieces in thinking about, that's where I have my control. I can build my skill, I can build my knowledge. It's not that I'm just bad at this. So that's the balance. So there's a few factors in coaching sessions that I think is helpful. So again, this idea of what's my frame of mind as I'm coming into a coaching session. And there's three separate pieces to this. And I think as effective coaches really have this ability to separate these out. So there's the person. There's that person I'm coaching. Everything about them that's personal, everything, all that dispositional pieces, all of who they are. But then there's this issue of the performance. Like, what does the performance relate to? Sometimes, and this is like a natural thing, you'll see it in our talk about attributional bias, is that sometimes we conflate or we bring together the performance with the person. We say that person's just bad at that. And so then we start to think, oh, they're just bad at that, right? They're just bad. Or they're ineffective, or they're resistant or something. It becomes part of the identity of that person in our mind. So we have to keep in mind these things are separate. The person is separate from their performance. And the third piece is there's a piece of evidence. So how do we bring in, like, what is telling us, what's the information that's telling us about that performance, not about the person, but how are we thinking about being very deliberate about, so what tells me that this person's performance is on track? What tells me that the person needs a little bit additional support? What tells me this person is like, we're ready to move on to something else. They've got, they've mastered this. And so those are the three things. I think to keep those three things separate in our minds is helpful in a lot of ways, to make sure that we are putting, as a coach, it's helping us manage so that that employee can keep the performance. What are the factors of the performance? And what's the evidence performance in my mind, rather than what is it about me that's not good at this? And that's that way of building that confidence and having that sense of control. So again, focusing on the performance and the evidence in the session. So this question is, how do we focus on that performance and evidence to minimize that, the focus on the personal, and then really to go back to, so we're going to focus on the skills and knowledge that we need to develop to increase the performance, rather than I just need to get better at this. I need to get, that's that way that a person can stay vulnerable and have the confidence to move forward. So a couple of pieces here just to keep in mind, and Wade's going to run you through an exercise a little bit that has part of this outlined. But again, there's a couple of things, and we've talked about this in previous talks. Part of that performance is there an agreement about what we're talking about as high-level performance in the organization? So if I'm in sales or if I'm in engineering, as an employee, do I understand? Am I aligned with what everybody else, what my manager and everybody else is saying is the definition of high performance? So we have advocated for companies to do this exercise where people are saying, here's what we say we do, here's how we define what effective practice is like, and you do work to get aligned across those things. And then it's also part of this are those definitions clear? Is everybody on the same page? There's nothing worse in a situation for me to go in with an employee and be working with them and they're not clear on what I'm talking about, because I have one perspective and they have a different understanding. So like, how are we getting to that point of clarity? And then that piece of the evidence here, the performance and the evidence, part of it is like, what are the sources of evidence that both of us have brought to the table? Ideally, in a coaching situation, I, as the coach, I'm going to bring some evidence that sort of we can look at. It's like this tangible thing that's outside the person that we can say, here's what the evidence looks like. Here's what the evidence that I have about your growth, about your achievement, the things that you're doing well, the things that we need to continue to support. And this idea of what's the story does that evidence tell that illustrates that growth or need for further support, or maybe it's additional resources that you don't have the resources you need, so we can move forward with that. And then that idea of, where you're always looking forward to that idea of a continuous improvement, looking forward to that next meeting, ideally like next week, in 2 weeks, whatever it is, part of it is bringing these things to closer proximity. But what's the evidence going to be at that next coaching session that's going to show progress towards the goal? So determining that ahead of time in this session, it's like, what are we going to bring, and what is evidence of performance, high performance or improvement look like in the evidence that we're going to bring? And then just a quick word about what counts as that data and that evidence. That idea of quantitative data, these are things you can count. So, it could be sales numbers. It could be, I made 50 calls this week and I had, 20 bites on the proposal. Or like, are things happening according to our agenda, or how efficient am I? That's all numerical data. We can look at that stuff. But the other, and often those are the numbers, those are sort of exclusively the things we bring in to the conversation. But there's other qualitative data, which are observable descriptions. So some of the things that we could bring in, and often this might be the piece that's brought by the employee, is, I'm struggling with my sales calls. So I'm going to make a audio recording of myself on a sales call. I'm going to bring that in and we're going to deconstruct deconstruct that, and we're going to work on that. I can hear it. I can listen to it. It's something that I can observe. So maybe it's a client survey. Maybe we're going to bring in, so here's what the clients are saying. Maybe as a coach, I'm going to observe you in your role. One of my favorite examples of this is Atul Gawande, the surgeon. He wrote an article for the New Yorker several years ago where he brought his medical school teacher into the operating room with him because he was working on trying to reduce his complication rate. And just through the observation, his coach said to him, you know, when you're doing that procedure, your elbow's too low, like raise it up a little bit. And apparently just that little movement, that was an observation he made, just that little movement helped reduce those, the complication rate. So the complication rate is a quantitative data. The observation about where your elbow height is the qualitative data. And then, you know, I'm not sure how much we do this in business, but I think this idea of reflective writing, you know, sitting down either after a session or before a session and think about, let's do a little writing about what this evidence means, how does it relate to my goals. Bringing that piece in to the discussion, I think is just another example. And again, we will do a conversation a little bit later about what are some of these qualitative data sources and what is the quantitative data sources that can actually tell the full picture of the story. With that, I will turn it back.
Zoltan, I think the answer to your question is, or maybe the answer to your theorization is that we don't do nearly enough reflective practice in business. And if you look at people who are really truly high performers, the executives that we work with that are really doing exceptional things, or people that you might see in the news, these people are the ones that are on their own time doing the reflective practice, take it upon themselves. And that's a very critical differentiator.
Yeah. And I think that idea of reflective writing, which the benefit of it is really thinking about, so here's the goal, here's the actual situation, there's a difference between it, and there's always a difference between it. You know, our goals never line up, because once we've achieved that goal and they're lining up, then we're going to set a new goal. But the reflecting around what's the difference between those two is really a key piece of this work.
Yes, and we will talk a little bit more about those reflective pieces in the exercise, but we wanted to also, as we've now set the stage for what kinds of things you might want to include in a continuous performance discussion, we wanted to talk a little bit about continuous performance as a process in your business. So what does this look like? If you said, okay, great, we're on board, we see the importance of keeping people vulnerable, we see the importance of us as leaders making a safe space for people to open up and think about what kinds of things they could be improving on. Now let's get practical. Let's talk about what this could actually look like in your business. So last week we gave a talk, and it was about alignment. And so we wanted to talk about, as part of this discussion, we talked about how things as a project have a different focus than things that you do in your business as a process. And so I wanted to just paint the picture of what it looks like, and you'll probably relate to this because you've probably been in a business that in an organization that does this, of what feedback as an annual project looks and feels like. Now, if you've done feedback as an annual project, I think hopefully this doesn't describe you entirely, but you can probably empathize with this a bit. As an annual project, doing a performance review consists of oftentimes sitting down in a big block of time that you've allocated to get this project done and hammering out as many of these performance reviews as you have. So you might say, oh, man, I've just put this off. I put this off. Like, this is the one time a year that we do this. There's a lot still going on every day at work. It's not like we're, often, I guess in most cases, businesses aren't taking a break from normal operations to do performance reviews. So you have all this other stuff going on, and now you have this big project that you have to do. So it gets put off a lot of the time. And then when you finally sit down to do it, you're trying to remember everything that happened throughout the year to give somebody an evaluation of how they're doing. So it's one meeting, it's one session where you're, more or less offering up all this stuff at once. And some of it might be from the very beginning part of the year. Hopefully there's some little bits of evidence that you've kept throughout the year, but oftentimes it's just what our best memory is, because we don't take the time, we don't have the note system that can give us that kind of insight right off the bat. So it's hard. And at the end, you might agree on some focal points from the information that you do have, but the employee is leaving this situation either feeling indifferent, like they didn't really learn that much. They just felt like this is a routine part of what we do. I don't know how much I got out of this. I understand I'm not perfect, but I also don't really understand what are the specific things that I need to do to get better. The employee might leave the meeting feeling great. They might feel like, wow, I just got a glowing performance review. This is awesome. Maybe I learned a few things that I could be doing better, but by and large, this was great. I got a super high rating. And they might leave feeling terrible. Like they might leave feeling like I'm just not doing well. I don't know what I can do differently. Like I'm getting told that I need to raise my numbers, but I'm not getting the kind of, here's how we're going to work with you to make this better, that I feel like would be the real supportive thing to do. Now, that's the focus is on more or less diagnosing what happened in the past. And so the way that we think about this is really this frame of the judge and the judged. And I know it's not like this in every situation, but in the worst case, somebody is feeling like my manager is just telling me everything that I've got to do better. And that isn't helpful. You're putting this person into this situation where their vulnerability is being taken advantage of, and they're going to shut down. So that is the opposite of what effective feedback is. And so what we want to do is really go to this process of giving feedback on a routine basis. So what does that look like? Well, that might look like a meeting every week, or a meeting every 2 weeks. And as we were just discussing, bringing evidence into these meetings. And so one thing that comes to mind, and this is a pretty funny analogy for me to think of, because I'm not a huge fan of American football, but there's a role in American football that's called the offensive coordinator. And what this person does is they sit in the skybox, so at the top of the stadium, and they're looking down at the plays that are being run on the field, and they're radioing down to the people the staff that are on the field, hey, this is working well, this isn't working well, let's change these things. And it's always being shifted around. So they're looking at what are the plays of the moment. So that's how I think about it. Like you want to have this meeting every week or every 2 weeks, whatever works best for your team, but more frequently, that you're diagnosing the plays of the past week or so. And what you're doing is you're using a structure, and we have had a previous session on inquiry-based discussion, what that looks like. So you're using a predetermined conversation structure in order to plan out what this effective meeting looks like. And so it's a simple meeting. It doesn't require this level of like intense remembering things. You're doing it, it becomes simple because you're doing it more often, and you're easier to remember. Okay, this is what we worked on last time. This is what our evidence is showing us. How can we implement these things in today's session? And so really the manager and the managee are becoming collaborators. They're working continuously on this stuff and the focus is on trying to make the person who's getting the session better. It's focused on their growth and not what's happened in the past. So this frame, and we talk about frames a lot in sales, like what frame are you getting into with people? This frame is the mentor and the mentee, which is a much more supportive relationship, one where feedback is actually celebrated, and one where the feedback that's being received is intended to help the other person succeed at their highest level, instead of diagnosing like these are things that you did well. And even though technically, yes, sure, the intention of an annual review is to help somebody succeed better, it isn't the same kind of relationship. And you can see why that would be, because the relationship is developed over the touch points that are happening. And so if you have that relationship that's once a year, we're going to have this deep dive into everything that's going well and not going well. Sure, you'll get some benefit from that. It's better than not doing it at all, but it's a completely different relationship when every week or so we're having a collaborative effort to discuss what I can take back to me, practice for a couple weeks, and start to do a little bit more of deliberate practice around. We like this idea of deliberate practice because that's how the people who are the best in the world at things get there. They practice one thing at a time or one little group of things at a time, and they are very focused, and then they iterate. And in that feedback rich environment is where great things can happen. So I did want to talk a little bit more about that. And we can start with the outline of really what we want you to be able to do at the end of this. So I want you to think about all your direct reports, and I want you to go to them on your next one-on-one session and say that you heard a helpful talk and that you have something new that you wanted to try. Once again, we're trying to create this idea of psychological safety. We don't want somebody to be like, oh man, is this going to be a gotcha of some kind? So just say that this is all helpful. Like, I would say it's better to overemphasize this than it is to think. And it depends on the relationship you have, but maybe if this is a big cultural change, think about how you can make that something that people find approachable. So then ask them, what is the number one thing that they're thinking about getting better at? If they don't have something that they're thinking about getting better at, that's a whole really helpful conversation that you can have, because chances are there is one thing or another. Even in your top performers, chances are your top performer won't say that they're not trying to get better at something. So I want you to ask them, what are the things that will allow you to improve in this area, and break it down really small. And what I mean by that is, if somebody says, I think, my sales numbers will improve if I'm able to book more meetings with people. So what does it take to book more meetings? So that's the thing that we're trying to get better at. Break it down into the sum of its parts, because that's what the thing that you're going to be coaching on really is the pieces that go into that. So those are the kinds of things that you want. And then ask that report to bring one piece of quantitative and one piece of qualitative evidence to the next session, and say that we're going to review this. We're going to break it down. I'm going to support you. We're going to talk about whether or not these focal points that you've outlined as the things that will help you drive, in this instance, more sales. What are those things that we can be working on? So that's how we're going to approach this conversation. And then we're going to ask these reflective questions, like, what would you have ideally like to have heard on this call? What would the ideal outcome have been? Like, what response were you looking for? How might you engender such a response? And then you can move to those action-driven questions, which are, how would you like to have seen this happen differently? And what would you do next time to work towards that outcome? So these are the kinds of things that we want to be bringing into our feedback conversations, because once again, the idea is to drive at specific, relevant, timely, which we'll be talking about in a minute, insights and action items that we can continually touch base on, so that we can see that improvement start to begin and help support that process. So we have 7 pieces of great feedback here at GoMobi.work, and we want to share them with you. And one of the things that we think about this is, it's going to be perhaps even everybody will interpret these a little bit differently, but think about these as kind of the overarching themes for what is great feedback and how it can be supportive. So effective feedback is number 1, it's constructive. It's going to reveal improvement areas, and it's going to do that in a way that is supportive and keeps people in that area of safety. Number 2, it's relevant. It's relevant to the individual. It's relevant to their goals. It's connected to the feedback from other sessions. We want to be sure that this feedback is not coming out of the blue, and that it's really targeted towards, hey, I know you're working on something like this, so here's a bit of feedback that might help you get to that goal better, faster, whatever it might be. Third is it's timely. And this is where the continuous performance management piece really comes in, because most of the time we're not delivering feedback in a very timely manner. We're waiting for a long time. So when you're delivering feedback in a timely manner, it becomes way easier to think about, okay, that situation is still fresh in my mind, and now I can envision how I might have handled it differently, or how I might do the same in the future. So
I was in your
yeah.
sports analogy with football. When you were talking, I had sort of another sports analogy as the pitching coach in baseball. Is the pitcher is up and there's 3 balls on a batter, and the batting coach comes out right in the middle of it to say, okay, what's your next pitch going to look like? It's really analogous to the offensive coach, because it's even more like, right now, this is what you're going to do next, which is that's a great metaphor for this kind of work.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. And we'll get into a little bit more into the timeliness in a second, but the idea also is that it's actionable. So we want to give these good suggestions, tangible suggestions. Like this is something that I could take back and implement. So that level of specificity. And then cogent, just really be sure to make your feedback understandable. If you have to phrase it in multiple ways, like maybe even after the person receives the feedback, ask them, is there any way I could help you understand this even better? Like, do you really feel like you're getting it, or could I do a better job of relaying it to you? And then finally, this sense of consistency needs to be throughout everything that your organization does. We talk about it all the time, but we really feel strongly that in the feedback arena, it's especially powerful because you're keeping with the norms that have been established. So we talk a lot about shared agreements. So what does a shared agreement mean? Well, it's something that we have all committed to. It's something that we all have said, we believe this to be true, and we're willing to be held to that truth. We're willing to strive for that. So that's what we mean by consistency. So just to dig a little bit deeper on 2 of these things, which are especially important: timing. Timing matters. We need to be delivering feedback in a way that is able to be received and acted upon immediately. So if these 2 sports examples are perfect. You have some of the highest performing organizations in the United States, at least. There's lots of different sports out there that have loads of, maybe to pick a more global sport, Formula One, there's a race engineer constantly in the ear of the driver saying, you're going too fast. The tires are getting too hot. We need you to slow down. And the drivers are able to then make an adjustment. So it's the same case. And I think it's astounding when people are confused why employees aren't getting things, or team members aren't executing on things maybe exactly as their performance review has encouraged them to act. Well, it's because they're not getting that continuous voice in their ear. So one of the things that we like to reiterate over and over and emphasize with this is that timing of feedback, and being in a feedback rich environment is one of the key conditions of flow. We've all heard this buzzword flow around, and it's exceptionally powerful if we can understand how to leverage it. And one of the conditions that the founding researchers that talk about flow have talked about is that flow happens in a feedback rich environment. So we need that constant to be on the edge, but constantly understanding what we're doing that's good, and what we're understanding that's bad. I think the race car driver example is a perfect example. If you get coached by a racing driver, they'll say that driving fast is just constantly correcting little mistakes. That's all it is. So if you're able to get that immediate feedback, if you think about driving a car, what you feel through the steering wheel, or if you feel the bumps in the road, then you understand, like, okay, there's a big bump. I need to maybe slow down a little bit, or the road's slippery, so I'm going to take my foot off the gas. So these kinds of continuous inputs are very important. And if there's no input as a reflective input, as a feedback input, you won't know specifically right away what's working and what's not working. So we have to create this environment where we can create that optimal performance state, because people are always focused on what's that little thing that I'm focused on right now, and how am I getting better at it over time. So go ahead, Zoltan.
Well, and I just was thinking, like, we haven't used this word too much in our conversations, but that idea of monitoring, like, that's really, as you said, that Formula One piece, that engineer they have tons of sensors on those cars that are monitoring everything, and that's the evidence, right? So the evidence is tied directly to monitoring, and then it's also tied directly to feedback, which I think is an interesting the idea of, what does monitoring look like? Is it immediate, or is it long, much bigger in time chunks?
Right. Yeah, and there's room for both of those things. When the systems that we create with clients are always focused on the near and the long term. So asking different kinds of questions to gather that information over time. Yeah, well said. So finally, we wanted to talk also and highlight relevance, because relevance is very interconnected with timeliness. Timeliness is generating relevance in a way. We want to be giving the person feedback that is supporting their most immediate challenges and helping them achieve their goals. And even if the goals are longer term goals, that continual focus on them, where our attention is going is what we are putting our energy into. And so what we need to do is make sure that our feedback is aligned to that, aligned to pushing somebody's attention in the right way. And the way that we can do that is making that feedback very relevant. And so if you're delivering feedback on very specific things, then it's easier for that person the next time they get into a situation where they're thinking about where this feedback could be applicable, it pops right into their head because it's continually coming in. This is relevant feedback. I remember this advice that I got for this situation. Boom, it's top of mind. It's ready to go. Now, deliberate practice is a term that I talked about before. Deliberate practice is this intentional practice that's done. It's not just if you do something enough times, you might get a little bit better at it. But if you do something in a particular way, like as in with the supervision of somebody who's much better at that thing than you are, you're going to advance much more quickly. It's why somebody might hire a coach. It's why the best performers in the world have people that take notes on how they're doing and allow them to make adjustments with that information. So those kinds of that deliberate practice is really how to get really exceptional at something. And that the feedback and the goal setting feedback loop as we go through this process of continuous performance development, we want to continually be looking for those artifacts where we're saying, this is what we've got made progress on. This is where we're still headed. This is where we've made progress on. These are a few things that need to happen in order to keep us moving in the right direction. So these things are all interconnected, but timeliness and relevance are going to be two of the most essential drivers for making sure that your continuous performance development is done effectively. So to bring us home.
And I think if I just make one more comment about the deliberate practice.
Absolutely.
That, like we've talked a little bit about sort of coaching around sales calls. It could be like I could see a week long, like we've got a week between our coaching sessions. Thinking about like what's your first sentence in a call with a client. Like just focus on that. Because sometimes we think about how am I going to improve the entire conversation, but a goal for a week is like, how am I going to make that first sentence so it's going to get the hook in there? That would be like an example of like a super small grain size that you could work on for a long time, get feedback on that, and then see what the performance is out of that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, Zoltan. Somebody's out there using ChatGPT to do it today. Guaranteed.
Exactly.
Love it. So just wanted to bring us home with the 7 elements of effective feedback. And we would love to hear if there's something else that comes to your mind when you think of effective feedback. Leave us a comment. We're super excited to start a discussion around this. So these are just things that we feel really, really strongly about. And we've seen the power of them when done correctly to create change in people, in organizations, and most of all in the world and of the inside the people that the organization serves, which is really the purpose of the organization. And when people are empowered in this way to change themselves, the impact that has on everybody that's part of that ecosystem is very profound. So write these down, pause your video, take a look, think about these. go and practice the exercise because it'll be really powerful, and you can change the culture of your team and bring these tools into the organization. Hopefully, people are wanting to get on board with that when you do.
All right.
All right,
Thank
everyone.
you, Wade. But hope this is
Yeah.
useful. We'll see you next time.
Sounds good, everyone. Bye.